The smoke was too thick to see anything. Thomas Mitchell held 3 terrified children against his chest, trying to protect them with his own body while desperately searching for the emergency exit he'd cleaned every single night for 3 years. His lungs were burning. The flames roared behind them, consuming the chemistry lab like a hungry monster. The smallest child, a girl maybe 7 years old, was crying uncontrollably. The boy in the middle was coughing so hard he could barely breathe. And the third one, Thomas recognized that face even through the soot and panic. Daniel Thornton, 8 years old, son of the man who had spent the last 3 years turning Thomas's life into a silent hell of public humiliation. The boy who had learned from his father that it was acceptable, even funny, to look down on the cleaner who scrubbed their toilets. And now this boy was clutching Thomas's shirt with a grip that would leave marks, eyes wide with pure terror, trusting that the garbage man he'd mocked countless times would save him. Thomas felt along the maintenance wall with his hands, searching for the doorknob that had to be there. Had to be, because if it wasn't, all 4 of them would die in that burning hallway. And somewhere out there, Richard Thornton, multimillionaire, CEO, the most arrogant man Thomas had ever met, was about to discover that he owed his only son's life to the man he treated like human garbage. 6 hours earlier, Thomas Mitchell was exactly where he always was at 4:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting on the edge of his bed in a 1-bedroom apartment in a building that smelled of permanent mold and abandoned dreams, trying to gather the energy to shower and get ready for his second shift of the day. His body ached. 59 years wasn't old, not really, but when you spend 6 hours lifting 50-pound trash bags, driving a truck through the potholed streets of Mobile, Alabama, being invisible to people who never make eye contact with the man collecting their garbage, 59 feels like 70. Thomas stared at the gray uniform hanging on the closet door. Thomas Mitchell, Magnolia Heights Academy Maintenance Services, embroidered in small letters above the pocket. He hated that uniform almost as much as he hated the reason he had to wear it. 3 years ago, Thomas Mitchell had a house. Not big, not fancy, but his. He had a wife. He had a bank account that didn't go into the red every week. Then the marriage imploded the way marriages sometimes do when 2 people discover they don't know each other as well as they thought after 22 years together. And the divorce lawyer cost $35,000 that Thomas didn't have. And the judge decided the wife got the house. And suddenly Thomas Mitchell was starting over at 56, discovering that the world didn't have much use for a middle-aged man without a college degree beyond jobs that broke your body and paid enough to survive, never to live. So Thomas worked 2 jobs. Garbage collector from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. Night cleaner from 9 at night until 5 in the morning. He slept 4 hours a night if he was lucky. He ate $3 frozen meals in front of a television that got 4 channels. He paid $800 rent for an apartment that was falling apart, but it was what he could afford. And he worked, and worked, and worked. Because the judge said a man in perfect health could easily work 2 shifts. Because the bills never stopped coming. Because the alternative was giving up completely. And Thomas Mitchell didn't know how to do that even when every bone in his body begged him to consider it. He got up from the bed with a groan nobody was around to hear, walked to the tiny bathroom, and turned on the shower that took 3 minutes to warm up. While waiting, he looked at his reflection in the cracked mirror. Gray hair that used to be black, deep lines around his eyes, shoulders that curved forward in a way they hadn't 3 years ago, calloused hands that looked like they belonged to a man 20 years older. This was Thomas Mitchell now. Garbage man in the morning, cleaner at night, invisible all the time. But the worst part wasn't the work. The worst part wasn't the exhaustion that sank into his bones. The worst part was Magnolia Heights Academy and everything that place represented. Magnolia Heights was a private school for Alabama's elite. $40,000 a year tuition. Parents who drove cars that cost more than Thomas would make in a decade. Kids who got new iPhones every year like they were candy. And Richard Thornton. God, Richard Thornton. CEO of Thornton Energy, a $3 billion oil empire. Father of Daniel, an 8-year-old boy who led the teasing whenever he saw Thomas in the hallways. Richard had turned humiliating Thomas into a form of entertainment. It started 6 months after Thomas was hired. Thomas was cleaning a hallway during a parent event when Richard walked by, surrounded by other equally wealthy parents, talking loudly about his latest business deal. He saw Thomas, stopped, and sniffed the air dramatically. Does anyone else smell garbage? Oh, Mitchell's here. That must be why. The other parents laughed nervously. Thomas pretended not to hear, kept cleaning. But Richard didn't stop. He never stopped. Seriously, Mitchell, do you shower between shifts? Because garbage collectors have a specific smell, you know. Months turned into years. The jokes got worse. Richard always made sure Daniel was around, teaching his son that it was acceptable to look down on people who serve you. And Thomas swallowed it all, smiled when appropriate, kept his head down, because men like him couldn't complain. A 59-year-old black cleaner complaining that a white multimillionaire CEO was humiliating him? Thomas knew exactly how that would end, so he swallowed, and swallowed, and swallowed, until swallowing became who he was. What nobody at Magnolia Heights knew, because nobody ever asked, because to them Thomas was just the garbage man, not a person with a history, was that Thomas Mitchell had a past. He'd grown up in Bayou La Barre, a small coastal community 20 miles south of Mobile. A working-class community, fishermen, refinery people, folks who worked with their hands and died young from cancer or industrial accidents that companies called unavoidable misfortunes, while paying families pennies to stay quiet. Thomas's father, Robert Mitchell, had worked 35 years at the Mobile Petroleum Refinery, high-pressure valve operator, dangerous work that paid well by local standards, well enough to put food on the table and keep a roof over the heads of 4 kids. Robert Mitchell was a quiet, serious man who understood that one mistake from him, one valve opened when it should be closed, one pressure reading ignored, could kill dozens of people. He carried the work home not physically, but mentally. He'd sit at the dinner table, staring at nothing, calculating pressures and temperatures in his head. And on summer nights when Thomas was 12, 13, 14, Robert would take his son to the refinery on weekends when he needed to check on something. Thomas learned. He learned the smell of every type of gas leak. He learned that electrical systems and gas-rich atmospheres were a lethal combination. He learned evacuation protocols, escape routes, where gas concentrations accumulated. He learned that wealthy men who ran refineries from air-conditioned offices made choices about valves and wiring based on cost spreadsheets, not on human lives. And when Thomas was 16, he learned what happened when those choices went wrong. An explosion in the east section of the refinery. An undetected gas leak because the sensors were old and the company was planning to upgrade, but never did because it cost money. A spark from faulty wiring. 5 men killed instantly, including Robert Mitchell's best friend, the man who had been Thomas's godfather, who had 3 young kids at home waiting for a father who never came back. The company paid the families $100,000 each and made everyone sign non-disclosure agreements. Robert Mitchell went back to work a week later, 20 years older in his eyes. He worked another 15 years at the same refinery, eventually dying of cancer at 62 that everyone knew came from decades breathing chemicals the company swore were safe. The company sent a bouquet of flowers to the funeral. $25 worth of wilted daisies for the family of a man who'd given 35 years of his life. Thomas never forgot. Not the explosion, not his godfather's funeral, not the cancer that ate his father alive from the inside, not the way companies treated men as disposable, and he certainly didn't forget the knowledge that came from working-class blood, not from a classroom. Knowledge about how gas systems worked, how to recognize leaks by smell, how old wiring and electrical overload created sparks that set the world on fire. Knowledge that Richard Thornton and the Magnolia Heights elite would never have because they learned from books, not from watching men die. It was 9:43 at night when Thomas reached the 2nd floor to begin cleaning the science labs. Gary had said the robotics club was meeting until 10 in Lab 3, so Thomas started on the other side. The chemistry lab, the physics lab, the small prep room where teachers kept equipment too expensive for students to touch without supervision. Magnolia Heights took pride in its science facilities. The chemistry lab had marble countertops, state-of-the-art fume hoods, equipment that universities envied, and built-in natural gas lines for Bunsen burners that students used in experiments. Old system, the building was 40 years old, but the school kept planning to upgrade the same way it had been planning for years. Upgrading cost money. Much easier to postpone and assume the old system would keep working because it always had. Thomas had heard that logic before, at the refinery where his father worked. It worked until it didn't, and then 5 men died. Thomas entered the chemistry lab, turned on the lights, and immediately felt something wrong. Not something he could see, something in the air. He stopped, inhaled slowly through his nose the way his father had taught him decades ago. There, subtle, almost imperceptible to someone untrained. Natural gas, not strong enough for alarms to detect, if those old alarms even worked, but unmistakable. Thomas felt adrenaline surge instantly. 43 years of instinct screaming danger. He followed the smell to the back counter where 3 Bunsen burners were installed. The middle valve had a fine crack leaking gas slowly, probably leaking for hours, filling the lab with a growing concentration. Thomas immediately went to the main shutoff valve on the wall, tried to close it. Stuck. Rust or minerals or years of neglect that nobody bothered to fix because a cleaner reporting problems wasn't taken seriously. He applied more force. The valve wouldn't move. His heart raced. The lab was filling with gas. The building's old electrical system, with exposed wiring he saw every night when he cleaned, with constant overloads from all the computers and equipment teachers left on even at night. One spark. It only took one spark. Thomas dropped his cleaning cart and ran downstairs to the maintenance office. Empty. Gary must be doing rounds, or maybe he'd stepped out to smoke, leaving his post abandoned like he always did. Thomas grabbed the office phone, dialed 911 with hands that were starting to shake. 911, what's your emergency? The female voice was calm, professional. This is Thomas Mitchell, cleaner at Magnolia Heights Academy, 2345 Riverside Drive. We have a natural gas leak in the second-floor chemistry lab. The shutoff valve won't work. We need firefighters here now and building evacuation. There's a student club meeting in Lab 3. The operator stayed professional, but he could hear urgency entering her voice. Firefighters are on their way, sir. Estimated arrival 6 minutes. Evacuate the building immediately. Don't use elevators. Don't turn on lights in areas that aren't already lit. Get out now. Thomas hung up and ran back upstairs, taking 2 steps at a time, despite knees that protested and a back that already ached. He needed to warn the robotics club, get those kids out before. He was halfway up the stairs when he heard it. Not a big explosion, not a cinematic boom, a small explosion, almost like a loud pop immediately followed by a growing roar. Thomas knew that sound. Gas igniting, fire finding fuel. Thomas ran up the last steps, turned into the second-floor hallway, and saw thick black smoke already pouring from the chemistry lab door. The fire was spreading fast, much faster than he expected. Flames licking the door frame, consuming the ceiling, feeding on decades of paint and varnish and materials nobody had considered flammable until they were tested by real fire. And then he heard what froze his blood completely. Screaming. Children screaming. High-pitched voices of pure terror. The robotics club. Lab 3 was adjacent to the chemistry lab. They shared a wall, and if fire spread through that wall, if the structure gave way. Thomas didn't think. His body moved on pure instinct, on decades of knowledge about industrial emergencies that his father had drilled into him through stories and warnings and lessons learned in the blood of dead men. He ran to the nearest bathroom, soaked his cleaner's shirt with cold water from the sink, wrung it quickly, and covered his mouth and nose. He returned to the hallway, now filled with smoke that burned his eyes and made his lungs sear with each breath. Fire alarms finally started blaring, piercing, penetrating, too late. The sprinkler system should have activated automatically. It didn't. Another planned upgrade that Magnolia Heights had been postponing year after year because $300,000 for a new system seemed expensive until the day the building caught fire. Thomas approached Lab 3, found the door closed. He tried the handle, locked from inside. Standard protocol that now became a death trap. He pounded on the door hard, his fist making noise. He prayed the kids could hear over the sound of alarms. Is anyone in there? You need to get out now. The building's on fire. Screaming from the other side. Children's voices, high with absolute terror. The door won't open. We can't get it open. It's stuck. Thomas understood immediately. The explosion in the adjacent lab had shifted the structure of the shared wall. The door was jammed in the warped frame. And these children, how many? 3? 5? Were trapped with fire spreading through the wall, smoke starting to seep through the cracks, maybe minutes before everything collapsed. How many times over the last 3 years had Thomas imagined simply giving up? How many early mornings at 3 o'clock scrubbing floors while his back screamed and his body begged for rest, had he thought, why keep going? Why endure the humiliation? He was invisible. Despised. treated as less than human by people who valued money over character. Thomas Mitchell didn't matter to anyone in that building. His life was a sequence of brutal work and loneliness and survival without greater purpose. So why not just walk out? Let the firefighters who were on their way deal with it. Save himself because nobody else in the world gave a damn if Thomas Mitchell lived or died? The answer came not in words but in memory. His father at the dinner table, calloused hands holding a coffee cup, tired eyes but steady. You do what's right not because people deserve it, not because they'll be grateful, not because there'll be a reward. You do what's right because it's who you are, and nobody can take that from you unless you let them. Thomas stepped back 3 paces and kicked the door with everything he had. Once, twice, old wood protesting but holding. On the 3rd try, he heard cracking. On the 4th, the frame gave way and the door swung open violently. Inside, Lab 3, 3 children, 2 girls, 1 boy. The girls looked about 7 or 8. Magnolia Heights uniforms covered in soot, faces wet with tears, eyes wide with terror no child should know. The boy was a little older, 8, maybe 9, and when Thomas focused on him, when he really registered that face through the smoke and panic, his stomach dropped. Daniel Thornton. Brown eyes identical to his father's, now wide not with arrogance but with pure animal fear, face covered with tears and soot, wearing a $100 designer t-shirt now dirty with ash. Richard Thornton's son. The boy who had humiliated him alongside his father for 3 years. The boy who deliberately kicked cleaning buckets, who pretended to smell garbage when Thomas walked by, who laughed when his dad made cruel jokes about the cleaner who was worth nothing. And now Daniel Thornton was looking at Thomas Mitchell, really looking, maybe for the first time. And Thomas saw not an arrogant child, but a terrified 8-year-old boy who desperately needed an adult to trust, to protect, to save. For a split second, just a split second that Thomas would later hate himself for having, a dark thought crossed his mind like a shadow. He could grab the 2 girls, leave Daniel, tell the firefighters he got there too late, that he could only save 2. Richard Thornton would spend the rest of his life knowing his son died, while the cleaner he tortured saved others. It would be poetic justice in a twisted way. It would be the revenge that the dark part of Thomas, the part that had accumulated 3 years of humiliation like poison, secretly wanted. But Thomas Mitchell wasn't Richard Thornton. He wasn't the kind of man who let a child die for revenge, no matter who the father was. That would be lowering himself to their level. And Thomas had spent his entire life proving, to himself, if nobody else, that he was worth more than that. "Come with me," Thomas said, voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his gut. "Now. Quick. We don't have time." He grabbed the 2 girls by their hands. Small hands cold with terror that clung to his, like they were the only solid thing in a world that was collapsing. He motioned to Daniel. "You stay close to me. Put your hand on my shoulder, and don't let go. Understand?" Daniel nodded, mute with terror, and obeyed. Thomas felt the small hand grab his shirt with desperate force. He guided the 3 back into the hallway. The smoke was so dense now that visibility was less than 3 feet. The heat was intense, almost physical, pressing against them like an invisible wall. The wet cloth on Thomas's shirt was already drying, losing whatever protection it offered. He could feel the skin on his face starting to burn just from proximity to the fire. The main staircase he'd climbed was 20 feet to the right, but Thomas knew burning buildings. He knew how fire and smoke behaved in ways that people who learned from textbooks never really understood. He knew that heat rose, that smoke took specific paths dictated by air pressure and architecture, that the obvious exit was often a death trap. The main staircase was filling with dense smoke he could see from here, smoke so black and thick that going down it would be like diving into a pool of ink. Suffocation in 90 seconds, maybe less for children with small lungs. But Thomas Mitchell had cleaned this building every night for 3 years. He knew every hallway, every door, every hidden service staircase that not even teachers remembered existed because it wasn't part of the pretty Magnolia Heights that parents paid to see. "This way," he said, pulling the children in the opposite direction from the obvious exit. "Trust me, I know another way." They followed through the secondary hallway, Thomas moving almost entirely from memory because visibility was essentially 0. His free hand touching the wall, counting doors by feel. 1, 2, 3, 4. There. An unmarked door that parents and teachers never noticed because it wasn't part of the presentable building. It was pure utility. A service staircase that maintenance staff used to move supplies, that Thomas climbed every night carrying his heavy cart because the service elevator had been broken for 8 months, and nobody cared to fix it because it was just for staff. Nobody from the elite ever saw this staircase. But this staircase was on the opposite end from the fire, and Thomas prayed it was still clear of smoke. He pushed the door and a bit of less smoky air came through. Not clean, would never be clean now, but breathable. "Go down," he ordered, guiding the first girl to the first step. "Hold the railing with both hands. Don't run, 1 step at a time. I'm right behind you." The 2 girls started descending, moving too slowly for his liking, but he couldn't rush them or they'd risk falling. Daniel hesitated at the top of the stairs, looking down into the darkness. Emergency lights should be on, but half were burned out. Another postponed maintenance issue. "Are you coming too?" the boy asked, voice small and scared in a way Thomas had never heard before. There was no arrogance there, no learned cruelty, just a terrified 8-year-old needing an adult to promise everything would be okay. Thomas looked at Daniel Thornton and saw not the boy who had humiliated him, but a child who had been taught wrong and still had a chance to learn different. "Yes," Thomas said, and meant it. "I'm coming, I promise. Now go down. I'm right behind you." Daniel descended. Thomas followed, closing the fire door behind them to contain the smoke as much as possible. The staircase was narrow, steps steep, railing rusty. Each breath still burned. The smoke followed them. Slower here, but persistent. But they were descending, moving, putting distance between them and the hell above. They emerged from the side exit door of the building. The door Thomas used every night when he arrived for work. The door the elite never saw because it was behind the bushes where the staff's old cars were hidden, exactly as 3 fire trucks roared into the front parking lot, sirens cutting through the night. Thomas guided the 3 children away from the building to the open lawn where the smoke dispersed into the night air. He collapsed to his knees, coughing so violently he thought he'd vomit blood. His lungs were on fire. Each breath was agony. The 2 girls were crying but breathing, sitting on the lawn hugging each other. Daniel was a few feet ahead, looking back at the burning building with an expression of shock that Thomas recognized, the look of someone who had just faced mortality for the first time and understood that life was fragile. Firefighters ran in all directions, unrolling hoses, shouting orders, beginning protocols Thomas knew by osmosis from growing up the son of a refinery man. Paramedics emerged from an ambulance with medical kits and stretchers. And then Thomas heard tires screeching violently in the parking lot, so fast and reckless they almost caused a second disaster. A black Maserati, which could only belong to one person in Mobile, Alabama, nearly hit a fire truck before stopping in a skid that left marks on the asphalt. The driver's door opened before the car fully stopped. Richard Thornton stumbled out, face pale as death, $3,000 suit wrinkled in a way Thomas had never seen, perfectly styled hair for the first time in complete disarray. He looked at the burning building, then at the firefighters, then swept the lawn with wild eyes of a father facing his deepest nightmare. "Daniel!" he screamed, voice breaking in despair that money couldn't buy or control. "My son was in there. Where's my son? Someone tell me where my son is." And in that moment, that singular, perfect moment, Thomas Mitchell understood he was about to witness something men like Richard Thornton rarely experienced: total, complete, devastating helplessness. The whole world seemed to be in slow motion. Richard Thornton, multimillionaire, CEO, a man who always controlled everything around him with money and power and unquestioned authority, was visibly falling apart. His hands were shaking. His face was contorted in pure terror that no amount of wealth could protect against. He grabbed a firefighter by the arm with force that probably hurt. "My son was in the robotics club, Lab 3. You need to go in there now. Now! I'll pay whatever it takes." The firefighter, an older man with gray hair and decades of experience etched into his weathered face, placed a firm hand on Richard's shoulder with professional patience. "Sir, I need you to calm down and step back. We'll find your son. But you need to let me do my job." Richard looked about to argue. Men used to giving orders don't take being told what to do well, especially when their son is in danger. When he heard a small voice that cut through the chaos. "Dad?" Richard spun so fast he almost fell. Daniel was running across the lawn, covered in soot but clearly alive, coughing but unharmed beyond the lingering terror in his eyes. Richard closed the distance in 3 long strides and grabbed the boy in a hug so tight that Daniel let out a small sound of air being squeezed from his lungs. "Daniel, my God. Daniel, are you okay? Are you hurt? Let me see you." Richard held his son's face with both hands, turning to check for injuries, eyes scanning every inch as if memorizing proof his son was alive. "I'm okay, Dad," Daniel said, voice hoarse from smoke, "but we were gonna die. The door wouldn't open and there was smoke and fire and we were gonna die." His voice broke. "But the cleaner saved us. He came in and got us out." Richard froze, his arms still around his son, but his body completely still, his face going through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, something close to total incomprehension. "What?" "The cleaner," Daniel repeated, and there was something different in his voice now. Not the casual arrogance he carried when talking about staff, but genuine respect mixed with still fresh fear. "He broke down the door because it was stuck and took us down the back stairs. The smoke was real bad, and we couldn't see anything, but he knew the way. We were gonna die, Dad. The fire was coming and we couldn't get out, and then he showed up." Richard slowly released Daniel, stood up, looked around the lawn with the expression of a man whose entire world had just turned upside down. Firefighters running, paramedics treating the 2 girls who had been with Daniel, teachers and staff who had evacuated grouped in panic at a safe distance. And then his eyes landed on Thomas Mitchell, still sitting on the lawn 20 feet away, hunched over his knees, coughing sporadically, cleaner's shirt soaked with sweat and covered in black soot, hands trembling slightly from fading adrenaline, too exhausted to move. For a long, horrible moment, Richard Thornton just stared. There was no immediate recognition, just confusion. He saw a gray cleaner's uniform. He saw a nearly 60-year-old black man with gray hair and calloused hands and shoulders curved from decades of hard work. He saw someone who clearly had been inside the burning building, who had risked everything. And then, slowly, horribly and inevitably, recognition came like a cold wave. Richard's eyes widened. His mouth opened slightly. Color drained from his face. "Mitchell," he said, and his voice came out strangely small, almost inaudible, from a man who always spoke with the absolute authority that money bought. Thomas slowly lifted his eyes. His lungs still burned with each breath. His back, always aching, always reminding him of the life he'd lost when divorce destroyed everything, was screaming now after carrying 3 children through dense smoke and descending stairs while inhaling poison. He was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical, beyond even emotional. It was existential exhaustion. 3 years of lonely nights, 3 years of swallowed humiliation, 3 years of being treated as invisible, as less than human, as a walking joke for the entertainment of the elite. And now, in this surreal moment on the lawn of a burning school, Richard Thornton was looking at him as if seeing a ghost. Or maybe for the first time was actually seeing Thomas Mitchell for real, not as a cleaner, not as a garbage man, not as an object of ridicule, but as a complete human being who had just done something all of Richard's wealth couldn't buy. "Yeah," Thomas said, voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion that penetrated to his soul. "It's Mitchell." There was no triumph in his voice, no petty satisfaction, just a statement of fact delivered by a man too tired for anything beyond basic truth. Richard took a shaky step toward him, then stopped, as if he didn't know what to do with his own body, as if all the rules he'd lived by, rules about hierarchy, about who mattered and who didn't, about value being measured in dollars, had been burned along with his building. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, words forming and dying before reaching the air. "You," he finally managed, and Thomas could see the effort it cost just to form a simple sentence. "You saved Daniel?" It wasn't really a question. It was a statement of fact that Richard's brain was desperately struggling to process, to fit into a worldview that never had space for the possibility that the garbage man he despised could be a hero when it mattered. Thomas nodded once, a small economical movement of his head that cost more energy than it should. Saved him and the 2 girls too. They were trapped in Lab 3. Door jammed from the explosion. Smoke was coming in fast. He coughed, spit black soot onto the lawn. "They're okay now. Shaken, but okay." He paused, looked directly into Richard's eyes for the first time in 3 years. Not the subservient look of employee to employer, but the look of equal to equal, of man to man. "It was my job, but they both knew it wasn't. Cleaning toilets was the job. Emptying trash cans was the job. Risking his life to save the son of the man who had publicly humiliated him for 3 years, who taught his own son it was acceptable to look down on the working class, who represented everything wrong with a system that valued money over humanity. That wasn't the job. That was a choice. And in that moment, in that space of heavy silence between them, Richard Thornton understood exactly the weight of that choice. The silence stretched out, dense and uncomfortable. Around them, chaos continued. Firefighters battling the fire consuming the entire wing of the second floor, paramedics treating minor cases of smoke inhalation, Gary finally appearing from somewhere yelling into his cell phone with supervisors about how this could have happened. But in that 20-foot space between Thomas Mitchell and Richard Thornton, time seemed to have stopped completely. Thomas saw the exact moment when the complete truth hit Richard. He saw the arrogance the man always carried like armor begin to crack, then shatter, then collapse completely. He saw 3 years of absolute certainty in his own superiority evaporate in the face of a reality that couldn't be denied or bought or lawyered away. He owed his son's life to the man he'd treated like garbage, and there was no amount of money in the world, no expensive lawyer, no form of public relations that could make that truth disappear or be any less devastating.